"You don't belong in this room anymore," my daughter-in-law said as she placed her manicured hand against the glass conference door, blocking my way with the kind of smile people use when they think they've already won. My son Daniel stood behind her in his charcoal suit, adjusting the cuff of his watch instead of looking me in the eye. "Mom," he said carefully, like he was speaking to someone fragile, "this is a high-level financial discussion. Vanessa thinks it's better if we handle it ourselves." I stared at him for a moment, trying to recognize the little boy who once cried because he thought monsters lived under his bed. Now he couldn't even defend me in front of his wife. The hallway outside the executive conference room smelled faintly of polished wood and expensive cologne. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Midtown Manhattan, the city glowing beneath a cold November sky. 23 years earlier, I had signed the paperwork that leased this entire floor for Carter Global Logistics, when it was still a struggling shipping company with only 14 employees and a warehouse outside Columbus, Ohio. Now the company was worth nearly $900 million, and apparently I wasn't important enough to sit at its table anymore. Vanessa folded her arms. Her cream-colored blazer probably cost more than my first mortgage payment back in 1984. "We're discussing restructuring, Evelyn," she said smoothly. "Legal matters. Banking exposure. It's complicated." I almost smiled at that. Complicated. I had spent 40 years building systems that moved freight across 3 continents during recessions, fuel shortages, labor strikes, and supply chain collapses. But according to my own family, I suddenly couldn't understand business anymore because my hair had turned silver and I preferred tea over champagne lunches. "Of course," I said quietly. I wouldn't want to slow everyone down. Daniel exhaled in visible relief, which hurt more than Vanessa's cruelty ever could. He stepped aside while an assistant hurried into the room, carrying presentation folders stamped with the company logo I had designed at my own kitchen table decades ago. No one invited me in. No one even pretended to. I turned and walked toward the elevator lobby in silence, my low heels clicking softly against the marble floor. Behind me, the conference room door shut with a muted click. The sound reminded me of a vault closing. As the elevator descended from the 42nd floor, I watched my reflection in the mirrored walls. 67 years old. Navy cashmere coat. Pearl earrings Harold bought me for our 30th anniversary. Calm expression. You would never guess my hands were trembling beneath the leather gloves folded in my lap. 3 years earlier, after Harold died from a stroke, I stepped away from public operations at Carter Global. Daniel told everyone I wanted a peaceful retirement in Connecticut. Vanessa encouraged the story. The grieving widow. The aging founder. The woman fading quietly into irrelevance while the younger generation took control. I allowed them to believe it because grief exhausts you in strange ways. After burying the love of your life, sometimes you simply stop correcting people. But silence has a dangerous side. The longer you stay quiet, the more people confuse your dignity with weakness. The elevator doors opened into the private parking garage. My driver, Malcolm, immediately noticed the expression on my face as he opened the back door of the black Mercedes. "Everything all right, Mrs. Carter?" he asked gently. I removed my gloves slowly. "Malcolm," I said, staring at the illuminated skyline beyond the garage entrance. "How long do you think it takes to freeze every executive account tied to a corporation?" His eyebrows lifted slightly in the rearview mirror once we were inside the car. "If the authorization comes from majority ownership," he said carefully, "about 20 minutes. I looked down at my phone. 17 missed notifications from the bank's legal division waited silently on the screen. Vanessa thought she had locked me out of the room. What she didn't know was that I still owned 51% of everything inside it. The drive back to Connecticut took almost 2 hours in evening traffic, but I did not mind the silence. Manhattan slowly disappeared behind us, swallowed by gray skies and bare November. Trees lining the interstate. Malcolm kept his attention on the road, wisely resisting the urge to ask questions. Most people think wealth announces itself loudly. They imagine private jets, flashing cameras, oversized jewelry, and people demanding attention every time they enter a room. Real wealth does not behave that way. Real wealth becomes invisible when necessary. That was something Harold understood long before I did. The house in Greenwich sat at the end of a winding stone driveway surrounded by maple trees that had already shed most of their leaves for winter. Harold bought the property 36 years ago when Carter Global finally turned its first real profit. Back then, the company only operated in 3 states. We celebrated by eating takeout Chinese food on the living room floor because we could not afford furniture after closing costs. I still remember Harold laughing while balancing lo mein cartons on his knees, promising me one day our grandchildren would run through these hallways during Christmas dinners. The memory felt painfully distant now. Malcolm opened my car door beneath the covered entrance while cold air swept across the driveway. Inside, the house smelled faintly of cedarwood and old books. Quiet, safe, untouched by Vanessa's perfume or Daniel's careful corporate tone. I removed my coat slowly and placed my purse on the antique entry table Harold restored by hand almost 20 years earlier. Everything in this house carried his fingerprints somehow. The brass lamp beside the staircase, the grandfather clock in the hallway, the library shelves he insisted on building himself after watching instructional videos for 2 straight weekends. Grief changes shape with time. In the beginning, it crushes you so completely that even breathing feels unnatural. Later, it becomes quieter, more patient, like an ache hidden beneath your ribs that only reveals itself during still moments. After Harold passed away, Daniel stopped visiting regularly within 6 months. At first he blamed work, expansion meetings, investor dinners, international travel. Then Vanessa started speaking on his behalf during phone calls. Daniel is exhausted. Daniel needs rest. Daniel cannot make the trip this weekend. Eventually the invitations stopped altogether. Family holidays moved to private clubs in Manhattan, where everything felt polished and cold. Even when I attended, I often felt like a guest someone forgot to introduce properly. I walked into the kitchen and turned on the small lamp above the stove instead of the overhead lights. Soft light always made the house feel warmer during winter evenings. The kettle began heating while I stood by the window overlooking the backyard. Years ago, Daniel built a crooked birdhouse out there during a middle school woodworking project. Harold refused to replace it even after it started leaning sideways. Character matters more than perfection, he used to say. Vanessa hated that birdhouse. She once suggested tearing it down before a charity garden party because it looked old and uneven. Harold smiled and told her some things stay standing because they are loved, not because they are beautiful. Looking back now, I think that was the moment she realized she would never fully control this family while he was alive. My phone buzzed softly against the marble countertop. One message, then another, then 7 more in rapid succession. I glanced down at the screen without touching it. Daniel, Vanessa, the company legal department, Wells Fargo Executive Services. I let every notification pile up unanswered while steam slowly rose from my teacup. 20 years ago, I would have rushed to fix things immediately. I would have softened my tone, protected everyone from consequences. Mothers are trained to do that. We spend decades cushioning the impact of our children's mistakes until one day we realize they have become adults who expect the world itself to bend around them. I carried my tea toward Harold's old study at the back of the house. The leather chair beside his desk still faced the fireplace exactly the way he left it the night before his stroke. Some evenings I could almost hear the turning of newspaper pages in that room. I sat down carefully and opened the top drawer of the desk. Inside rested a dark blue folder containing the original ownership structure of Carter Global Holdings. My name remained exactly where Harold insisted it should always stay. Sole controlling authority. I woke before sunrise the next morning, something Harold used to tease me about during our early years together. You wake up like a woman preparing for battle. He once laughed while pouring coffee into my favorite blue ceramic mug. At the time, we were still living in a cramped apartment above a laundromat in Columbus, surviving on canned soup and impossible optimism while trying to convince local distributors to trust a company operating out of a rented garage. Funny how life circles back around. At 67 years old, I found myself preparing for another battle entirely. The house was cold when I walked downstairs wrapped in a wool cardigan. Outside, frost clung to the edges of the backyard garden, turning the grass silver beneath the pale morning light. I stood at the kitchen counter waiting for the coffee maker to finish while my phone continued vibrating every few minutes across the marble surface. 23 missed calls, 12 voicemails, 14 emails marked urgent. I ignored every one of them. Silence unsettles people more than anger ever will. By 8:30, I settled into Harold's study with a yellow legal pad and began reviewing documents I had not touched in nearly 3 years. Corporate trusts, shareholder agreements, executive compensation structures, lines of authority. The deeper I read, the more obvious Vanessa's strategy became. She had not simply tried to push me aside socially. She had been dismantling my visibility piece by piece for years. First came the harmless little changes. My reserved parking space disappeared from the Manhattan office because new executives needed easier access. Then my direct assistant of 19 years suddenly retired early after Vanessa recommended fresh energy for the executive floor. Family charity events stopped listing me as founder and instead referred to me as Daniel Carter's mother. Even the annual Christmas gala invitations changed. My name moved lower each year until eventually it appeared beneath junior board members I had personally hired fresh out of college. At the time, I told myself, none of it mattered. Ego becomes exhausting after enough decades in business. I had already proven myself. I did not need applause anymore. But sitting there in Harold's study, I finally understood something painful. Vanessa had not been making random decisions. She had been rewriting the family hierarchy slowly enough that nobody noticed the shift happening in real time. Especially Daniel. That realization hurt more than anything else. My son was not cruel by nature. Weak, yes. Easily influenced, absolutely. But not naturally cruel. As a boy, Daniel used to leave handwritten notes in my briefcase before major meetings. Good luck, Mom. You are the smartest person there. I kept dozens of those notes for years in my office drawer. The first time Vanessa visited our Greenwich home nearly 15 years ago, Harold pulled me aside afterward and quietly said, "She is very polished, but she studies people the way investors study balance sheets." I laughed at him back then. I thought he was being overly cautious because nobody would ever seem good enough for his son. Now I wished I had listened more carefully. Around 10 o'clock, the landline rang. Very few people still used that number anymore. I almost let it go unanswered before instinct made me pick up the receiver. "Mrs. Carter," a familiar voice asked carefully. "This is Arthur Benson." Arthur had served as Carter Global's chief financial officer for almost 28 years before retiring to Vermont. He attended Daniel's graduation party, sent flowers after Harold died, the kind of loyal man corporations rarely produce anymore. "Arthur," I said softly, "I had a feeling you might call." He exhaled heavily. "Evelyn, there are things happening inside the company that you need to know immediately." I leaned back slowly in Harold's leather chair while morning light stretched across the study floorboards. "How bad is it?" There was a long silence on the other end before he finally answered. "They were planning to remove your remaining authority permanently during yesterday's meeting." I closed my eyes briefly. Somehow hearing the words aloud still felt different than suspecting them. Arthur lowered his voice. "And Vanessa already prepared paperwork transferring several family-controlled assets into a separate holding structure under Daniel's executive authority. They were moving faster than you realized." Outside the study window, wind stirred the empty branches of the maple trees. Winter was coming early this year. Arthur arrived at the house shortly after noon carrying a worn leather briefcase and the same tired expression I remembered from quarterly audits 20 years ago. Time had softened him around the edges. More gray hair, slower movements. But his eyes remained sharp behind thin silver glasses. Men like Arthur spend entire careers studying numbers, and numbers rarely lied for long. I led him into Harold's study while rain tapped softly against the windows. The weather matched the heaviness sitting in my chest. Arthur placed the briefcase carefully on the desk before removing several folders thick with financial documents. "I debated making this call," he admitted quietly. "But Harold trusted me to protect this company from outside threats. I never imagined the threat would come from inside the family." I sat across from him holding my untouched tea while he opened the first folder. The numbers spread across the desk looked cold and clinical at first glance. Corporate restructuring proposals, executive transfer authorizations, asset reallocations. But beneath the legal language sat something far uglier. Intent. Vanessa pushed hard after Harold passed away. Arthur continued. At first she framed it as modernization. Younger branding. More aggressive expansion. Daniel followed her lead because she made him feel confident. That sounded painfully accurate. Confidence had always been Daniel's weakness. As a child, he constantly searched for approval before making even small decisions. Harold used to say our son wanted reassurance more than success itself. Vanessa understood that instinct almost immediately. She praised him constantly in public, while quietly isolating anyone who challenged her influence behind closed doors. I remembered the first holiday dinner where I noticed the shift clearly. It was Thanksgiving, about 8 years ago. Harold carved the turkey, while Daniel discussed opening new distribution hubs in Texas. I casually mentioned concerns about over-leveraging during uncertain fuel markets. Before Daniel could respond, Vanessa smiled and said, "That is how older generations think. Fear first." The room went quiet for a moment. Harold set down the carving knife very carefully before saying, "Experience is not fear, Vanessa. Experience is the reason this family can afford imported wine with dinner." She laughed lightly afterward and changed the subject, but something colder settled beneath the surface that evening. Looking back now, I realized she had been testing boundaries even then. Arthur slid another document across the desk toward me. This was prepared 3 weeks ago. My eyes moved slowly across the page. Long-term executive succession restructuring. Authority reassignment. Revocable trust modifications. One sentence near the bottom tightened my chest immediately. Residential transition planning for dependent family members. Dependent, I repeated quietly. Arthur removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. They discussed assisted living options during a private executive dinner in September. For several seconds, I simply stared at him without speaking. Outside, rainwater slid slowly down the study windows while the grandfather clock in the hallway ticked steadily in the silence. "They were going to move me out of my own home," I finally said. Arthur nodded once. "Eventually, yes." Strangely, I did not feel shocked anymore. Only tired. Deeply tired in the way people become after carrying disappointment for too many years without admitting its weight. I stood and walked toward the bookshelf near the fireplace where dozens of framed family photographs still lined the shelves. Daniel at age 10 holding his first baseball glove. Daniel graduating from Yale. Daniel smiling beside Vanessa on their wedding day while Harold rested one proud hand on his shoulder. Families never collapse all at once. The damage happens quietly. One ignored comment. One manipulation excused for the sake of peace. One betrayal normalized because confronting it feels too painful. By the time the truth becomes impossible to ignore, the foundation has already rotted underneath everyone standing on it. I picked up the wedding photograph slowly. Vanessa looked radiant in white silk, leaning close to Daniel beneath the Connecticut summer sunlight. I remembered hugging her tightly that afternoon, whispering welcome to the family against her cheek. For years I blamed myself for not seeing her clearly sooner. But the truth was simpler than that. Kind people often assume kindness in others until reality forces them to stop pretending. Arthur cleared his throat gently behind me. "There is something else you need to know." I turned toward him slowly. Yesterday's meeting was not only about restructuring. He hesitated before continuing. "Vanessa intended to announce your full retirement publicly next month at the shareholder gala. They already prepared the speech." Arthur left shortly before sunset, but the weight of his words lingered in the study long after the front door closed behind him. I remained seated beside Harold's desk, staring at the prepared shareholder gala speech spread across the leather blotter. Vanessa's writing style was impossible to miss. Smooth, polished, empty in all the places that mattered. After decades of dedication, Evelyn Carter has chosen to step fully away from the public responsibilities of Carter Global Holdings in order to enjoy a peaceful private retirement surrounded by family. I read the sentence twice before quietly setting the paper down again. Surrounded by family. The irony almost made me laugh. For years I had mistaken proximity for loyalty. Blood does not always guarantee devotion. Sometimes it only guarantees familiarity. Darkness settled early across the property while wind rattled the tree branches outside the study windows. I finally stood and walked upstairs to the master bedroom Harold and I shared for nearly 4 decades. His side of the closet still remained untouched except for occasional dusting. 3 years later, and I still could not bring myself to move his winter coats. Grief does not operate on schedules no matter what people say. Some losses simply become part of the architecture of your life. I changed into a soft, gray sweater and sat at the edge of the bed, holding the shareholder gala speech in my lap. The event had once been Harold's favorite night every year. He loved walking through the ballroom shaking hands with warehouse managers and junior employees as though they were celebrities. Never build a company that only respects people in expensive suits, he always said. That philosophy built Carter Global more than any financial strategy ever did. We promoted from inside, paid fair wages during recessions, helped employees keep healthcare coverage even during difficult years. Harold believed loyalty should travel both directions between companies and workers. Vanessa never understood that kind of thinking. To her, people existed in categories: useful, important, replaceable, decorative. I remembered a charity dinner 2 winters ago when she criticized one of the longtime warehouse supervisors for arriving in an off-the-rack department store suit. Some people do not belong at executive tables, she whispered to me with a thin smile while sipping champagne. The cruel part was not even the comment itself. It was how natural cruelty sounded in her voice. Like judgment came easier to her than breathing. My phone buzzed again against the nightstand. This time I answered. "Mom," Daniel said immediately, relief flooding his voice. "Finally, I have been trying to reach you all day." I remained quiet for a moment, listening to the distant sounds of traffic behind him. Manhattan noise. Busy. Impersonal. "How is Vanessa?" I asked calmly. Silence stretched briefly across the line before he answered carefully. "She is upset." Of course she was. People become emotional very quickly once consequences arrive at their doorstep. "The account freeze caused problems today," Daniel continued. "Payroll authorizations stalled. Corporate cards stopped working. Even the executive expense system locked us out." I looked down at Harold's wedding band resting beside my bedside lamp. After his stroke, the hospital returned it to me inside a small plastic bag along with his wallet and watch. Strange how entire lives eventually reduce themselves to objects small enough to fit inside your hands. "That sounds inconvenient," I said softly. Daniel exhaled sharply. "Mom, this is serious." "No, Daniel," I replied quietly. "What happened yesterday was serious." Another silence. Longer this time. I could almost picture him rubbing his forehead the way he always did during stressful meetings. "Vanessa did not mean to offend you," he finally said. "The meeting was complicated and emotions were high." There it was. The excuse. Always wrapped carefully in soft language designed to smooth over sharp truths. I closed my eyes briefly. "Your wife stood between me and a company I built with my own hands," I said. Then my son watched it happen. His voice lowered immediately. "Mom, please." That single word carried exhaustion, embarrassment, and something dangerously close to fear. For the first time in years, Daniel finally understood he no longer controlled the situation. I stood slowly and walked toward the bedroom window overlooking the dark backyard. Snow had started falling lightly across the garden, small quiet flakes disappearing against the stone patio. "Do you know the saddest part?" I asked him softly. "I kept waiting for you to stop her." Daniel did not answer my question right away. I could hear him breathing softly on the other end of the line, while snow continued drifting across the backyard outside my bedroom window. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded smaller somehow. Less certain. "I thought keeping the peace was the best thing for everyone," he said quietly. I closed my eyes for a moment. People often confuse peace with silence. They are not the same thing. Silence only hides damage until it grows large enough to collapse everything built around it. "Keeping the peace for who?" I asked softly. Another long pause followed. Then Daniel lowered his voice even further. "Vanessa thinks you never respected her." The sadness that settled over me then felt heavier than anger ever could. After everything I had done to welcome that woman into this family, that was the story she told herself. I remembered helping plan their wedding when the venue unexpectedly doubled its pricing 6 months before the ceremony. Harold and I quietly covered the difference, without embarrassing them. I remembered flying to California after the birth of their daughter so Vanessa could rest while I handled feedings and laundry for 2 straight weeks. I remembered defending her during family disagreements, even when I privately questioned her behavior. Respect had never been the issue. Control was. "Daniel," I said carefully, "your wife does not want respect. She wants authority without accountability." His frustration surfaced immediately. "Why does everything have to become a battle?" I almost smiled at that. "Because someone declared war on me in my own company." Silence again. Then finally, almost reluctantly, he asked the question both of them had been avoiding all day. "How much authority do you actually still have?" Snow tapped softly against the bedroom windows while I considered my answer. Enough. He exhaled sharply under his breath. Somewhere behind him, I heard Vanessa speaking quickly, asking something I could not fully make out. Daniel covered the phone for a moment before returning. The board is panicking, he admitted. Several senior executives are threatening to delay tomorrow's acquisition vote until account access is restored. Of course they were. People become nervous when stability disappears unexpectedly, especially wealthy people. That sounds wise, I replied calmly. Mom, this could cost the company millions. No, I said quietly. What almost cost the company everything was placing ambition above loyalty. He fell silent again. I could feel the tension tightening around him through the phone line itself. Daniel had spent years convincing himself he inherited Harold's leadership instincts simply because he inherited Harold's position. But leadership is not passed down like cufflinks or vacation homes. It reveals itself during uncomfortable moments, during pressure, during conflict. And my son had spent years surrendering difficult decisions to the loudest person in the room. Vanessa wants to meet tomorrow, he finally said. Face to face. I walked slowly toward Harold's side of the closet while holding the phone against my ear. His navy wool overcoat still hung exactly where he left it before his final business trip to Chicago. Why? I asked. To clear up misunderstandings. There it was again, that careful language. As if cruelty transformed into confusion once consequences arrived. I touched the sleeve of Harold's coat gently. There is no misunderstanding, Daniel. Your wife made her position very clear yesterday. His voice sharpened slightly. She made a mistake. No, I replied softly. A mistake is forgetting someone's birthday or sending the wrong paperwork. What happened yesterday was a decision. The line went quiet enough that I wondered briefly if he had disconnected. Then I heard him say something so quietly I almost missed it. I did not think you would fight back. Those words settled into the room heavier than anything else he had said all evening. Not because they were cruel, because they were honest. For years they had mistaken my patience for surrender, my silence for weakness, my grief for helplessness. I sat carefully at the edge of the bed again, while snow continued falling outside the darkened windows. That, I said calmly, was your first serious mistake. The next morning arrived gray and bitterly cold, the kind of Connecticut morning where frost clings stubbornly to every branch and rooftop long after sunrise. I woke early again, though I had barely slept. Some nights your mind refuses rest, because too many memories keep demanding attention all at once. By 7 o'clock, the kitchen smelled faintly of coffee and cinnamon toast, a habit Harold carried from childhood and passed down to me over 40 years of marriage. I stood near the stove watching snow melt slowly along the stone patio outside when Malcolm entered through the side door, carrying the morning newspapers. There are reporters outside the Manhattan office already, he said carefully while placing the papers beside my coffee cup. Someone leaked information about the frozen executive accounts. Of course they had. Corporate panic spreads faster than truth ever does. I unfolded the business section quietly and immediately saw Carter Global's name splashed across the front page beside words like instability and leadership concerns. Vanessa was probably furious. She spent years obsessing over appearances because she understood something important about wealthy social circles. Reputation often matters more than reality. Has Daniel called again? I asked. Malcolm nodded once. 3 times since 6:30 this morning. I almost smiled into my coffee cup. Yesterday, they treated me like an aging inconvenience standing outside a conference room. Today, they could not make a decision without my approval. Funny how quickly power rearranges people's behavior. Around 9 o'clock, my personal attorney, Rebecca Holloway, arrived carrying 2 thick binders and an expression sharp enough to cut glass. Rebecca had represented Carter Global during several major acquisitions over the years and possessed the rare ability to remain perfectly calm while dismantling people twice her size in negotiation rooms. Harold used to call her our secret weapon. I reviewed the executive transfer attempts, she said immediately after settling into Harold's study. Vanessa underestimated the trust protections significantly. She opened the first binder across the desk while I listened carefully. The controlling ownership structure cannot legally be altered without your direct authorization. Not Daniel's. Not the board's. Yours. Hearing the words aloud settled something inside me I had not realized still felt uncertain. Not fear exactly. More like disappointment heavy enough to blur judgment. Rebecca adjusted her glasses and slid another document toward me. However, they did attempt to bypass certain approval chains through temporary executive authority motions. I scanned the signatures slowly. Daniel's name appeared repeatedly beneath pages. Vanessa had clearly prepared herself. There it was again, my son following instead of leading. He signed everything, I said quietly. Rebecca gave a small nod. Yes. Outside the study window, snow continued falling softly across the backyard. The world looked strangely peaceful considering how much damage greed had already caused inside this family. Rebecca leaned forward slightly. Evelyn, if you want my honest legal opinion, yesterday was not simply disrespectful. It was strategic positioning. I rested my fingertips against the edge of Harold's desk. I know. She studied me carefully for a moment before asking the question nobody else seemed willing to ask directly. What exactly do you intend to do? I thought about that carefully. Anger would have been easier. Rage creates momentum, clear enemies, immediate reactions. But this situation felt older and sadder than simple anger. Families fracture slowly, one compromise at a time, one silence at a time, one humiliation accepted because confronting it would ruin dinner or upset the children or create tension during holidays. Until eventually someone wakes up and realizes they have spent years shrinking themselves just to keep everyone else comfortable. I am not interested in revenge, I finally said softly. Rebecca raised one eyebrow slightly. Then what are you interested in? I looked toward the framed photograph of Harold resting beside the fireplace. He stood in front of our first warehouse, smiling proudly in faded blue jeans with grease stains on both sleeves, because the loading dock equipment had broken that morning and he insisted on repairing it himself. We built everything together from almost nothing. Every late night, every risk, every sacrifice. Consequences, I answered quietly. Before Rebecca could respond, my phone lit up again across the desk. Vanessa Carter calling. Vanessa waited exactly 4 hours before calling again. That alone told me more than her words ever could. People like Vanessa believed patience was weakness because they had never truly been powerless before. Real patience comes from surviving things money cannot solve. Loss, grief, betrayal. I let the phone ring twice before answering. Evelyn, she said immediately, her voice smooth but stretched tight beneath the surface. I think this situation has escalated unnecessarily. I remained quiet, listening to the faint background noise behind her. Office chatter, ringing phones, controlled chaos. Somewhere inside the Manhattan headquarters, executives were probably scrambling to explain why company accounts suddenly stopped functioning overnight. You embarrassed me in front of the board, she continued when I did not respond. The sentence settled into the silence between us like something fragile and absurd. Not you hurt me. Not we made mistakes. Embarrassment. Reputation. Optics. Even now, that was where her priorities lived. I walked slowly through Harold's study while holding the phone against my ear. My fingertips brushed the spines of old business books he used to reread during stressful quarters. Interesting choice of words, I said calmly. Excuse me. You are concerned about embarrassment after asking security to escort me away from my own boardroom. She exhaled sharply. That is not what happened. The lie came quickly. Too quickly. People often reveal themselves most clearly in the stories they rewrite first. Daniel said emotions were high yesterday. She continued carefully. We were under pressure. The restructuring meeting became tense. Nobody intended to hurt you. I paused beside the fireplace, staring at the framed photograph from our 20th company anniversary gala. Harold stood beside me smiling proudly while Daniel, still in his 20s then, looked nervous wearing his first tailored tuxedo. Back when he still sought our guidance instead of our approval. Do you know what your real mistake was, Vanessa? I asked softly. Silence. Then a colder voice answered. I am sure you are about to tell me. You believed power belonged to whoever spoke the loudest in the room. Her tone sharpened immediately. I helped turn this company into a global operation. Yes, I replied calmly. And somewhere along the way, you started believing expansion meant ownership. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Outside the windows, snow continued drifting quietly across the property while the fire crackled softly beside me. Finally, Vanessa laughed once under her breath. Not warmly. You really think Daniel can run this company without me? There it was. The truth beneath all the polished manners. Not partnership. Dependency. She had built her identity around becoming indispensable. This conversation is not about your importance, I said quietly. It is about your behavior. Her composure slipped slightly after that. Behavior, she repeated sharply. I spent years cleaning up inefficiencies Harold refused to address because he was sentimental. I modernized branding, increased profit margins, opened international channels. Meanwhile, you disappeared into that Connecticut house, pretending grief made you untouchable. The words hung heavily in the air between us. Strange how resentment eventually leaks through even the most polished people. I lowered myself carefully into Harold's leather chair. You hated that Harold still held influence over Daniel, I said softly. Because as long as he was alive, you were never the center of this family. She inhaled sharply but did not deny it. Some truths arrive too directly for denial. You always looked at me like I was temporary, she finally said. Her voice sounded different now, less controlled, more human. Because I saw the way you studied people, I answered quietly. Like relationships were transactions waiting to be negotiated. The silence afterward stretched long enough that I wondered if she had hung up. Then finally she spoke again, much softer this time. What happens now? I looked down at the frozen account authorization papers still resting open across Harold's desk. Consequences. That was the word I used earlier with Rebecca. Not revenge. Consequences. Tomorrow morning, I said calmly. The board will hold another meeting. Her breathing tightened immediately, and I stared at the snow gathering across the dark backyard. This time, I replied quietly, I will be in the room. The board meeting began at 9 o'clock sharp the following morning under a ceiling of gray Manhattan clouds and nervous silence. When Malcolm opened the car door outside Carter Global Headquarters, reporters immediately turned toward me like birds sensing movement across still water. Camera flashes reflected against the black marble entrance while executives hurried through revolving doors pretending not to stare. Funny how quickly people rediscover your existence once authority returns. I stepped into the lobby wearing Harold's favorite navy wool coat and a simple strand of pearls. No dramatic entrance. No raised voice. Real power rarely needs performance. The elevator ride to the executive floor felt strangely familiar, as though the building itself remembered me even if certain people inside it tried not to. Employees standing near the back wall straightened slightly when I entered. One young assistant lowered her eyes nervously before whispering, "Good morning, Mrs. Carter." Respect always returns eventually. Sometimes fear escorts it through the door. Outside the conference room, Rebecca waited beside Arthur Benson, holding several legal folders against her chest. Daniel stood near the windows with exhaustion carved deeply across his face, while Vanessa remained seated at the far end of the long walnut table, perfectly composed in a white blazer that looked chosen specifically for battle. But this time I noticed something different beneath her posture. Uncertainty. Small. Controlled. But present. Conversations stopped completely when I entered the room. Nobody asked me to leave. I took my seat slowly at the head of the table where Harold used to sit during quarterly reviews. The chair felt colder than I remembered. For a moment, I almost expected to hear his voice beside me making some dry joke about overpriced Manhattan coffee. Instead, there was only silence. Rebecca opened the first folder carefully. As legal counsel for Carter Global Holdings, she began calmly. I am formally confirming that Mrs. Evelyn Carter remains sole controlling authority over the Carter family trust and majority voting structure attached to all executive governance decisions. Across the table, several board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Vanessa kept her expression steady, but Daniel lowered his eyes immediately toward the polished tabletop. Rebecca continued speaking while Arthur distributed updated financial reports to the room. Due to unauthorized executive restructuring attempts initiated without controlling authorization, Mrs. Carter exercised her lawful right to suspend discretionary executive access pending internal review. Nobody interrupted her. Nobody challenged the documents. Numbers carry a particular kind of cruelty because they remove emotion from accountability. Facts simply remain standing after excuses collapse around them. I folded my hands. Quietly atop the table while snow drifted beyond the windows overlooking Manhattan. I built this company with my husband over 42 years, I said softly. Not once during those years did we confuse leadership with entitlement. Vanessa finally spoke then. Evelyn, nobody questioned your contribution. I turned toward her calmly. You removed me from my own boardroom. Her jaw tightened slightly. We were trying to modernize operations by preparing assisted living arrangements for me behind my back. The silence afterward felt absolute. Daniel looked up sharply toward Vanessa, while several board members exchanged stunned glances across the table. There are moments when truth enters a room so completely that denial becomes impossible. Vanessa's expression changed for the first time since I arrived. Not anger. Exposure. She had not expected Arthur to speak. Had not expected documentation. Had not expected consequences. Daniel stared at her with something close to disbelief slowly spreading across his face. You told me that paperwork was precautionary, he said quietly. Vanessa turned toward him immediately. Daniel, in truth, the strongest kind simply removes access and walks away.